In the realms of fiction, there are no characters more iconic than Dracula the Vampire and Frankenstein's monster. While their origins were born on the printed page, their stories were quickly adapted to the motion picture, as early as 1910, with this silent version of Frankenstein made by Thomas Edison's film company. Bram Stoker's Vampire followed soon after with two unofficial adaptations, Dracula's Death, now a lost film, and F.W. Murnau's classic Nosferatu, which would have become a lost film if Stoker's widow had gotten her way. Once the movies learned how to speak, it didn't take long for Universal Studios to adapt the two books as talkies. If you saw my previous video on the censorship of King Kong, you'll know that by 1934, the Hays Code demanded stricter rules regarding what kind of material was being shown in movies. Even though Dracula and Frankenstein did not receive as harsh treatment as Kong for their 1938 re-release, their edits are noteworthy and have impacted the film until quite recently. Although the cuts made to Dracula are very minute, they are worth mentioning and interesting to compare. At the tail end of the film, Dracula's hideout is discovered by Van Helsing, and the vampire takes out his anger on Renfield. In the original version, Renfield yells out in agony as Dracula strangles him to death and drops his lifeless body down to the bottom of the staircase.
Oh no, don't! Don't kill me! Let me live, please! Punish me, torture me, but let me live! I can't die with all those lines on my conscience! All that blood on my hands! Ah! Ah!
Now notice in the 1938 release, Renfield's screams are muted. Not a big deal to us today, but someone during this time decided those agonizing screams were too much for post-code audiences to handle.
I can't die with all those lines on my conscience! All that blood on my hands!
We move on to the second edit, which takes place very soon after the staircase scene. Van Helsing discovers the vampire in his coffin and destroys him with the now classic stake through the heart routine. Dracula's death frees Mina from the Count's spell, and she returns to normal. Similar to Renfield's screams, Dracula's death knell is muted in the re-release version.
Mina!
Shots of creatures crawling out of coffins, Dracula's brides, and Renfield's obsession with eating insects were apparently cut from foreign prints of the film, although I haven't come across any of that footage to include for comparison. For its original release, there was also an epilogue added, with Edward Van Sloan warning the audience as they leave the theater.
There are such things.
These shots seem to be all that still exists from that epilogue, unless Universal happens to have the entire piece to restore one day. Interesting, as Sloan would intro Frankenstein in much the same way, coming out from behind a curtain and warning the audience of the horror they were about to experience. Speaking of Frankenstein, we now move on to that film, which was released, if you can believe it, the same year as Dracula, 1931. This film was subject to more censorship than Dracula for its 1938 release. Two major scenes were altered. The first, when Henry Frankenstein brings the monster to life in his laboratory. When the monster's hands begin to move for the very first time, Victor is overcome with insanity and exclaims,
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! In the name of God! Now I know what it feels like to be God!
The story of Frankenstein had been a controversial one from the very moment the book was released in 1818. The concept of playing God made many upset that a story could even be written that dares play with such blasphemous ideas. Even 100 years later, the film version touched nerves in much the same way. During its original release, many states threatened to ban the film or requested over 1/4 of the scenes be removed, depending on each state's personal views on the subject matter. When the film was re-released, this line was cut short with an awkward splice and lightning strike sound effect to cover the audio.
It's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive.
Even later, early restored versions, such as this one from 1987, still had this line slightly edited.
It's alive. It's moving. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive. In the name of God. Now I know what it.
More recent editions have restored the entire line back into the film, as it was heard in 1931. There were also a few brief close-up shots of Fritz torturing the monster, which were removed for the re-release version, thought to be too disturbing. And now we reach the Pistou Resistance. After the monster escapes Frankenstein's castle, he runs into a little girl who is wholly unafraid and attempts to befriend him. The monster, used to everyone running and screaming when he appears, is intrigued by the girl's kindness. She brings him down to the lake, which causes an unintended accident by the monster. It's a heart-wrenching scene, much like the sequence in the sequel with the blind man. Censors were very apprehensive about this scene, even in the lax days of 1931. Apparently, the latter half of the scene was cut out in some states, even on its original release. Here we see the censored version, which, oddly enough, seems more sinister as you never see what happens to Maria. Her demise is left to the viewer's imagination, and while it's revealed later on that she drowned, the censored cut leaves out the obvious fact that it was an accident by the monster and not premeditated. That alters the entire character's personality and makes him a far less sympathetic character in the long run.
No, you're hurting me! No!
These scenes were lost until the mid-1980s, when they were discovered in a print owned by the British National Film Archives.
No, you're hurting me! No!
Now, if only Universal would restore and include Edward Van Sloan's epilogue for Dracula to a future release, fans could say they now own the complete versions of both these landmark films. Thanks for watching, and if you like what you see, subscribe and share this video.